Join us and welcome to Generation X Paranormal. The body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered approximately at 3:40 a.m. on Friday, 31st August of 1888 in Bucks Row. The thing with Bucks Row that you have to imagine is when they say a row, it was a row of housing. There is no in between. There's no cut through. There's no breezeway. It is just a row of housing. That's really important when it comes to, number one, the disposition of her body and what we may allude to later. Initially, she was found by Charles Cross. He was a carter and he would deliver goods on a horse-drawn carriage. He found her at approximately 3:40 a.m. laying in Bucks Row on her back, and her legs were straight out and her skirt was raised to her waist. And this is what he reports. So very shortly after Cross's discovery, there was another driver that Robert Paul wasn't really paying much attention to them. He just figured that this particular lady was passed out on the floor or the ground, and there was a man, what he would probably imagine would be a gentleman caller with her, and didn't pay him much mind. However, Cross stood in the middle of the road and said, "Hey, come on over. There's a situation over here." Both men walk over to the body and they examine. Now, Cross touched the woman's face, which was still warm, and then her hands, which were cold. Well, they were both kind of unsure what to do at the time, and Paul's idea was, well, let's go ahead and get her propped up, because if she's still alive, let's get her off the ground. And at that time, Cross said, "I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want to touch this woman. Let's just leave her where she is and how she is." And then Paul said, "Well, okay, well, if that's the case, then I'm going to go get some help." So Paul starts to leave the area, and instead of Cross staying with the body, he decides to accompany him. And as they leave, they run into a constable, and this constable named Misen, he goes to them and says, "Hey, there's a lady who's either dead or something's wrong with her, and there needs to be some kind of medical attention to her." And Misen says, "Okay," and at that particular time, this is interesting, Cross pulls him aside and says there's already another PC with her. And so he didn't really ring the alarm, so to speak, because he figured, well, there's already a cop over there. So the two leave, and Misen decides to head towards Bucks Row. When he gets to Bucks Row, there was, in fact, another PC there, and that's how the alarm was started. Now, the disposition of the body is pretty rough. We're talking about there is a large pooling of blood beneath her head when they discover her, and they also notice that her throat had been slashed all the way to the vertebrae. And I can tell you right now that is no small feat. That's a lot of mass and muscle to get through to scrape the vertebrae. And I know this is pretty graphic, but you got to consider that's one heck of a sharp knife to be able to do something like that. And not to mention that she had been stabbed in the abdomen and on the side. But the one thing that really strikes to mind is that there was no record of blood or anything when the two left the body. And in addition to that, they had decided to pull her skirt down together because they wanted to give her some kind of dignity. That's how the body was discovered, and that is when the alarm was sounded, and that was the first of the Canonical Five. So moving on to the next victim of the Canonical Five, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Nicole.
Okay, so the second victim was Annie Chapman, and she was murdered in Hanbury Street of Spitalfields. I hope I said that right.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, she was 47 years old when she died, and she lived at the Crossinghams Lodging House at number 35 Dorset Street. She crocheted and I think sold flowers, and on the side did prostitution. But she was only known for like servicing two men, basically. This Harry the Hawker, which is what they called him, and the other man was Ted Stanley, and the other lodgers would call him the pensioner, but he wasn't actually a soldier or anything, what they had said. He was actually a laborer. He was also a suspect because he was known to tell the guy that owned the lodgings, Timothy Donovan, that if she ever showed up with any other men, to turn her away. So he seemed jealous to me.
Gotcha.
So on September 8th of 1888, Chapman had been lacking the required money for her lodging that night. So she drank beer and left, had some pills, they said, in an envelope, and she got a baked potato for herself. These are all the witness statements of what they saw.
There's a staple dinner for you. Pills and a potato.
Well, for the poor, that's how they stayed alive.
Sure.
So at around 1:35 a.m., she returned to the lodging house, and then she left again to go, probably, they assumed, some prostitution so she could earn money, because she told them, "I won't be long. See that Tim keeps the bed for me." So she was last seen walking in the direction of the Spitalfields market. A Mrs. Elizabeth Long testified that she had seen Chapman talking with a man at 5:30 a.m., that they were standing behind the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, and she described the man as being over 40 years old, a little bit taller than Chapman, with dark hair and a foreign, shabby, genteel appearance, which I'm not sure what that means at that time period.
I would think genteel would probably be like gentlemanly, wearing nice clothing, maybe something of that nature, maybe.
Well, he was wearing a brown, low-crowned felt hat and possibly a dark coat. So yeah, that would probably, yeah. So she was able to hear the man ask Chapman, "Will you?" And she replied, "Yes." So, "Will you do me?" Yes.
La.
Yeah. And that's supposedly the last time that she was seen. So that was at 5:30 a.m. Annie Chapman's body was discovered shortly before 6 a.m. by a resident of 29 Hanbury Street named John Davis. The front door was open and the back door was shut, and her body was laying on the ground near the doorway to the backyard with her head 6 inches from the steps. Davis alerted 3 men named James Green, James Kent, and Henry Holland, and they all ran down Commercial Street to find a policeman. At the corner of Hanbury Street, the men found Divisional Inspector Joseph Lunas Chandler and told him another woman has been murdered. He followed the men to her body, and he requested assistance of the police surgeon, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, and more officers. Several policemen showed up, and they were instructed to clear the passageway to the yard so that the doctor had access. He arrived at approximately 6:30 a.m. He was quick to establish that there was a definite link between Chapman's murder and the murder of Marianne Nichols. She had also suffered 2 deep slash wounds to the throat, inflicted from the left to the right of her neck, before the murderer had mutilated her abdomen, and a blade of similar size and design had been used in both murders. He also observed that 6 areas of blood spattering upon the wall of the house, between the steps and the wooden palings dividing 27 and 29 Hanbury Street. Some of these spatterings were 18 inches above the ground. There were 2 pills which she had been prescribed for a lung condition. A section of a torn envelope and a small piece of frayed coarse muslin and a comb were recovered close to her body. A leather apron, partially submerged in a dish of water located close to a tap, was also discovered close to her body. So somebody had cleaned themselves up.
Aha.
Some of the press reports claim that 2 farthings were also found in the yard close to her body.
Is a farthing money?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I don't know how much money, but that's what they used to call it. At least in England. I don't know about other countries, but...
Sorry, my English listeners. I'm an idiot.
No, I listen to a bunch of medieval stuff, so I know what the farthing is. They talk about it in Robin Hood, the farthing.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but there's no reference made to the coins in the police records, so that could have just been made up for the press. Who knows?
Gotcha.
On September 13th, Dr. George Bagster Phillips described the body as he observed it at 6:30 a.m. in the backyard of the house at 29 Hansbury Street. The body was terribly mutilated. There was no evidence of a struggle having taken place. He was positive the deceased entered the yard alive. A handkerchief was around the throat of the deceased when he saw it early in the morning. He should say it was not tied on after the throat was cut. I mean, this next part, which is the gross part, but
Sure.
it's important to go over it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Her throat had been cut from left to right so deeply that the bones of her vertebrae column bore striations.
Yeah, from the blade.
Yeah, so like marks, right? And she had been disemboweled with a section of the flesh from her stomach being placed on her left shoulder and another section of skin and flesh, plus her small intestines being removed and placed above her right shoulder. The morgue examination revealed that part of her uterus and bladder was missing.
Good Lord.
Her protruding tongue and swollen face led Dr. Phillips to believe that she may have been asphyxiated with the handkerchief around her neck before her throat was cut.
God, if there's any person with any kind of compassion, that would be accurate.
And that the murderer had held her chin as he performed it. As there was no blood trail leading to the yard, he was certain that she was killed where she was found. I mean, there's more to about, what she could have been, suffering from as far as just medically, that they have to go over as well. But that's has nothing to do with her actual murder. I just, which I think they said with some of these murders, they're pretty sure that they're strangled first before they did this. And I would hope to God that, even though that's not a great way to go, it's better than the other.
That's, that in itself, I mean, obviously any murder, nothing's a great way to go.
Right.
But if there's any compassion in this world, these women were asphyxiated prior to that. And I mean, to think of how violent some of these murders were, I mean, it's just, I mean, I know it's not something we all like to talk about because it is pretty gross, but still, that's part of this whole history. That's part of this entire story, is just how violent this was.
Yeah.
So for the next victim, Elizabeth Stride, it's a pretty big departure from some of the disposition of the victims prior, right? She was still considered part of the Ripper victims because of how her throat was slashed, but there was no disembowelment. And it's really been argued for a very long time that the Ripper, that is, didn't have time to do the things that he does, So there's not a ton to go over with the crime scene, but on September 30th, P.C. William Smith saw Stride with a man wearing a hard felt hat. Her body was discovered at approximately 1 a.m. on Sunday, the 30th of September in 1888. And what's interesting about that, she did not have the same kind of disposition. Now, she was still a working girl, as they would imagine, but she was a little better clothed and was in a little bit of a different area than some of the original victims, the first two anyway. But from the way that it was expressed is that he was hurried here. So it's so far out of the norm of his normal killings that it's really tough to dive really deep into this, because there was no, thank God, but there was no very heavily macabre scene. It was a woman with her throat slashed for sure. And some even will argue that she wasn't part of the Canonical Five, but she definitely was, just especially with the way her throat was slashed. Post-mortem, they said the body was lying near side with the face turned towards the wall, the head up, and the feet towards the street. The left arm was extended, and the right arm was over the belly, and the back hand and wrist on the clotted blood. There's kind of already this positioning of extremities, which is why they also think this was linked to Jack the Ripper. And I think what had happened is he was about to get into the disembowelment when he was rushed. The deceased had a silk handkerchief around her neck, which is which makes that interesting because obviously she was asphyxiated. It kind of leans heavily into the fact that this was a Jack the Ripper victim because of the disposition of the body and because of the neckerchief or the handkerchief around her neck, the asphyxiation. But there was a very deep gash again, and she was cut all the way through to the bone again. To understand the amount of muscle, to understand the amount of just sheer material to get to somebody's bone like that, it either spells to both a incredibly sharp instrument that they were using and just the strength and brutality of Jack the Ripper.
So we just covered Elizabeth Stride, and the fourth one was Catherine Eddowes, and the two of these are known as the double event, right? Because they basically happened one right after the other.
Like 30 minutes or so, maybe an hour. But yeah.
September of 1888, she was with this John Kelly, which was just a partner. It wasn't a husband.
Right.
And they would do work together, and she would make money by cleaning and sewing for the Jewish community in the nearby Brick Lane. But she's also been known to take casual prostitution to pay her rent, which is seems to be a common theme in
casual prostitution, yeah.
Whitechapel. So not like an everyday gig, but when they needed extra money, it's what they would do.
Yeah, just a part-time hoe.
Yeah, and then and she said that she was there to claim the reward offered for the arrest of the Whitechapel murderer, adding, "I think I know him."
You're kidding.
Yeah, that's interesting. Wow. At 8:30 p.m. on Saturday, September 29th, P.C. Lewis Frederick Robinson observed a small group of people outside number 29 Aldgate High Street. Okay. When he got to the crowd, he observed Catherine Eddowes lying drunk on the pavement. Like I said earlier, she's been known to drink a lot. Yeah. So he helped her to her feet and leaned her against the shutters of the house, but she just slumped back to immediately fell.
I think we've all been there.
So he summoned assistance from this PC George Simmons, and they took her to the Bishopsgate police station and basically, to sober up. Right. So they put her in a cell to sober up.
Right.
And when she got there, she wouldn't give her name. She gave her name as nothing.
As nothing?
Yeah, wouldn't tell them.
Okay.
So shortly after 12:30 a.m. on the morning of September 30th, she asked this PC George Hutt when she could be released. And he said, well, when you're capable of taking care of yourself.
Yeah, well, you can't stumble your ass out here.
Yeah. So 30 minutes later at 1 a.m., she was, they said, okay, you're sober enough to be released. So he's like, all right. She's like, all right, good night, old cock. That's what she said. So she's probably not a very pristine woman.
Her elegance level is fairly low.
Yes. But before she was released, which is interesting, and why this would happen, so she must have known her. So they didn't have her down on record or her actual real name. She gave her name and address as Marianne Kelly of 6 Fashion Street. And Marianne Kelly is our 5th victim.
You're kidding me. Huh. That is one heck of a stretch. Now, real quick recap. She goes there with the intention of finding Jack the Ripper because she thinks she knows who she is.
No, she wants reward money.
Yeah, she wants reward money, which of course. And while in the drunk tank, we'll just call it, says that gives for them the name of Marianne Kelly, victim, who just so happens to be our next victim. Jeez. That is such a tangled web of crap. It's just wild.
It's weird. So when she left the station, instead of turning right to take the route to her lodging house where she was supposed to go, she turned left to go back to this Aldgate where she was found drunk. She was last seen alive in a narrow walkway named Church Passage at 1:35 a.m. So this is only 35 minutes after she was released.
Wow. That's not long.
So there are 3 witnesses who saw her at that time.
Okay.
Okay. So they said she was wearing a black bonnet and jacket, and she was standing talking with a man of medium build with a fair mustache at the entrance to Church Passage, which led southwest from Duke Street into Mitre Square. She was facing the man with one hand on his chest, although not in a manner to suggest that she was resisting him. He said that the man was approximately 30, about 5'7" in height, and wearing a loose-fitting pepper and salt color loose jacket, a gray peaked cloth cap, and a reddish neckerchief.
Okay.
So he thought that this guy looked like a sailor, is what he said.
Interesting.
He walked right past them, so he was right up next to him.
Right, yeah. Which would make, I mean, if she was casually doing her other job, I mean, maybe she did have a little sailor fling before. I mean, we don't know, right?
Well, at that point, it doesn't matter who it is.
Exactly.
She needs money.
Right. Well, that's a good point, yeah.
Yeah. So at 1:44 a.m., Eddowes' mutilated and disemboweled body was found lying on her back with her head resting on a coal hole.
Coal hole.
So didn't they used to shoot coal down into where they burned it and stuff? Didn't they have chutes and stuff like that, or where they kept it for the fires or something?
Yeah, I think so. Kind of like a storage area or something, maybe?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Mm-hmm. And turned towards the left shoulder in the southwest corner of Mitre Square by the square's beat policeman, P.C. Edward Watkins, approximately 14 minutes after he had previously passed through the square at 1:30 a.m. Upon discovering her body, Watkins called for assistance from the night watchman at the Curly and Tongue warehouse, which bordered Mitre Square. Ex-policeman George James Morris. Morris had been sweeping in the landings inside the warehouse with the door to the square open when Watkins knocked on the door, saying, "For God's sake, mate, come to my assistance." After viewing the body, he informed Watkins he had noted nothing unusual that evening. So at approximately 2:55 a.m., a blood-stained fragment of her apron was discovered at the bottom of a common stairway at a tenement in Goulston Street, Whitechapel, by P.C. Alfred Long. This section of apron was also contaminated with sections of fecal matter, and Long was adamant the garment had not lain in the doorway when he had previously passed this location at 2:20 a.m. Scrawled upon the wall above the section of apron was a crude chalk graffiti, basically. The letters measuring approximately 3/4 of an inch, and it says which it's spelled Juwes, but the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Oh. So trying to make it into a hate crime or something?
Sure. Yeah.
So the police decided not to take pictures of it or let anyone know about it, and they actually had it washed from the wall at 5 a.m. Because they didn't want to start a anti-Semitic war, basically.
Aside from the contaminating possible evidence, but yeah, I get it.
But they did copy it down,
right?
And they said there was a lot of grammatical errors. So it wasn't someone well educated.
And it's interesting because with these victims, they all have what appears to have been asphyxiated prior to all this going on. So there wouldn't be a ton of blood spray because there's no pressure built up in the body.
Right. So after washing the left hand carefully, a bruise the size of a sixpence, recent and red, was discovered on the back of the left hand between the thumb and first finger. A few small bruises on the right shin were of an older date, so it didn't happen from that. The hands and arms were bronzed. No bruises on the scalp, the back of the body, or the elbows. The face was very mutilated. There was a cut about 1/4 of an inch through the lower left eyelid, dividing the structures completely through. The upper eyelid on that side, there was a scratch through the skin on the left upper eyelid near to the angle of the nose. The right eyelid was cut through to about 1/2 inch. There was a deep cut over the bridge of the nose extending from the left border of the nasal bone down near the angle of the jaw on the right side of the cheek. This cut went into the bone and divided all the structures of the cheek except the mucous membrane of the mouth. The tip of the nose was quite detached by a cut from the bottom of the nasal bone to where the wings of the nose join onto the face. A cut from this divided the upper lip and extended through the substance of the gum over the right upper lateral incisor tooth.
Gosh.
There was on each side of a cheek a cut which peeled up the skin, forming a triangular flap about 1.5 inches. On the left cheek there were 2 abrasions of the epithelium under the left ear. The cause of death was hemorrhage from the left common carotid artery. The death was immediate and the mutilations were inflicted after death. There would not be but much blood on the murderer. The cut was made by someone on the right side of the body, kneeling below the middle of the body. I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, we'll save everybody from the deep nastiness because we got that coming up.
He had to have a lot of time.
Yeah, obviously had time. And when you look at that one, to me, that brutality, we really hadn't seen that prior. Now we've seen the disembowelment, we had seen the, just how deep the cuts to the neck were, but nothing of this magnitude. To me, it's like with the previous victim, he was rushed, right? So he's pissed. He's good and pissed. And from my understanding, it's a good 10-minute walk or so from the last victim to this victim. So he's stirring. That whole time, he's probably MFing this and these mother effings and, he's pissed. So when he gets to her, he is charged up. He is ready to take it out on her, and it shows. I mean, that level of mutilation, I mean, good Lord. And folks, if you want to look this up, there are pictures of her body, and it's
awful.
It is awful. If you're a little weak of stomach, I would not do that. But just to me, it doesn't spell somebody who was of good frame of mind. I mean, who would be in a good frame of mind? But he was so angry, and he took it out on her.
Yeah, and I mean, even the doctor was like, looking at the body, he said it gave no evidence of anatomical knowledge in the sense that it evidenced the hand of a qualified surgeon. He concurred that the perpetrator may have held the degree of knowledge expected of a butcher or a slaughterman, which we'll get to later.
Yeah, we will.
So it's important to say that.
Right.
He said that the first doctor at the crime of the scene and medical officer William Sedgwick Saunders, who was also present at the autopsy, said that the killer lacked anatomical skill and did not seek particular organs. So it was just like a frenzy, basically.
He's pissed. Okay. Well, that is unnerving.
Yeah.
But however, as unnerving as it was, it is not, and pales in very large comparison to how unnerving the last victim was. And we're going to cover that one together because there's just so much in there. We had mentioned all of these have been on the road so far. So it's happened on roads and backyards. So it's all been under an open sky. And if you understand that time frame, the Whitechapel area was heavily patrolled by cops because it was a bad area.
It was a slum.
It was a slum. So they're moving around. He's got to, he's getting pissed because they're interrupting him, and he has moved on. He is evolving as a predator. So now he decides, well, I don't want to be on the road anymore. So we're going to go indoors. And indoors he did go. We're, of course, referring to the last canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly.
And as we know with serial killers, each one, they go further and further with the way that they kill.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of the detail because we kind of have to. It's important to what happened. But, folks, if you're weak of stomach, don't look it up. But there are pictures And I don't know if they're actual pictures or if it's somebody who drew it, but no, there is pictures.
Well, they did have photography.
Yeah, they did have
it's just like
photography.
the old black and white.
Sure.
Nothing's very clear.
Right.
Thankfully.
Yeah, not for this one. So, Mary Ann Kelly. So, we mentioned that this is now moved indoors. And as you would imagine, that afforded a lot of time for our assailant. So on the morning of 9th of November of 1888, Kelly's landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant, he was an ex-soldier, Thomas Boyer, to collect the rent. Apparently, Kelly was 6 weeks behind on her payments, and I guess he owed him 29 shillings. So shortly after 10:15 a.m., Bauer knocked on the door but received no response. He then attempted to turn the handle, and he only discovered, of course, it was locked. Boyer then looked through the keyhole, but could not see anybody in the room. And apparently there was a hole in one of the panes of the glass, but it was covered up by some clothing. So he pushed it aside, and he peered in the room, and of course he discovered the extensive mutilated corpse laying on a bed. She is believed to have died between 3 and 9 hours before the discovery of her body. Okay. Boyer then ran to report this to McCarthy, which is odd to me because I would have first gone to the police. But instead he decided to go to his boss. And of course, he was instructed to go to the Commercial Street police station, and that's what he did. So he went there and reported, and his exact words when he went in there, he said, "Another one, Jack the Ripper, awful. McCarthy sent me." He said that to the inspector, and the inspector was Walter Beck. So Beck accompanied him back to Miller's Court, which is where this happened. And, of course, you know what they found, right? So basically how it goes is they immediately requested for assistance from the police surgeon, George Bagster Phillips. And he also gave orders preventing any individuals from entering or exiting the yard. So basically he locks down the whole area, which is what you would expect somebody to do. And he also arranged for the news of the murders to be telegraphed to Scotland Yard. Now we got the big boys coming in, right? And he requested the assistance of the bloodhounds. The scene was attended by Superintendent Thomas Arnold, and the inspector was Edmund Reed. Wasn't Edmund Reed the guy in, Ripper Street?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I remembered something. So anyway, he was in Whitechapel's H Division, as well as Frederick Aberline, who was also in Ripper Street. Okay, so they were from Scotland Yard. So they arrive on the scene anywhere from, I think, between 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. And news of the discovery of this victim spread really fast, as you would imagine, on East End. Crowds estimated over, I think, 1,000 gathered on Dorset Street, and many of the members of the public were voicing their frustration and indignation of the news. So you got to figure there's been a whole slew of murders, right? And even 2 in one night. So these people are scared. They want to know what's going on. And now apparently there's this other victim. So they're pissed. So they're gathering around kind of in a protest style to them saying, hey, this is unacceptable, right? So anyway, long story short, they locked down the scene. They got people in there. They're taking pictures. And now we're going to go into a little bit of the disposition of the body. So getting into the postmortem. Again, guys, I want you to understand this is pretty brutal. And I only feel it's important to go over some of these details because it gives you an idea of how absolutely, well, I'm just going to say psychotic of a killer he was. But at any rate, so Thomas Bond and George Baxter Phillips examined the body. Phillips and Bond timed her death about 12 hours before the examination. Phillips suggested that the extent of mutilations would have taken 2 hours to perform. That's a long time. Bond noticed that the rigor mortis had set in when they were examining it, indicating the death occurred roughly between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. Bond's official document pertaining to his examination and the overall subsequent post-mortem state is as follows. The body was lying naked in the middle of the bed, the shoulders flat but the axis of the body inclined to the left side of the bed. The head was turned to the left cheek. The arm was close to the body with the forearm flexed at the right angle and lying across the abdomen. The right arm was slightly abducted from the body and rested on the mattress. The elbow was bent, the forearm supine, and the fingers clenched. The legs were wide apart and the left thigh right angles at the trunk, and the right forming obtuse angle with the pubis. So basically, she's laying on her back, and her legs are manipulated so that her knees are up and kind of resting open, right? The whole surface of the abdomen and thighs were removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied to its viscera. The breasts were cut off, and the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. So once again, the brutality of the face again. The tissues of the neck were severed all around to the bone. The viscera was found in various parts of the uterus and the kidneys, with one breast under the bed or under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side of the spleen. I'm sorry, the intestines and the right side spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on the table. The bed and clothing at the corner were saturated with blood, and the floor beneath the body was pulling up about 2 square feet. So that's a lot of blood. So the wall on the right of the side of the bed with a line was aligned with the neck was marked with blood which had struck in several places. So once again, Dexter style. The face was gashed in all directions. The nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears were partially removed. The lips were blanched and cut in several incisions. I'm not sure I know what that means, but obviously it had been cut pretty severely, down to the chin, actually. There were also numerous cuts extending irregularly across the features. The neck was cut through the skin, down to the vertebrae, of course, and the neck was showing distinct ecchymosis, which is basically a way of saying, bruising. The larynx was cut through to the carotid cartilage, and both breasts, as we mentioned, were more or less removed with incisions. So, again, I won't go too much further into this because I think you're getting a pretty good picture of the overall scene of the murder. So she is completely mutilated. Her entire body is destroyed. Her face is destroyed. There are parts of her that are cut. I mean, this is as gruesome of a scene as it sounds to see. So we have moved from quick murders to now we have had a very long time with the victim. So with that, I think it's important to kind of talk about a few of the things that weren't associated with the body. Nicole, what was the situation with the candle?
So I guess she had bought a candle in November, which is a single candle. So the room was very dimly lit.
Okay.
But they found like a huge fire, and it had been fueled by women's clothing. So probably her clothing and who knows, past victims' clothing, whatever.
Sure.
But they thought it was because he wouldn't be able to see to do his work. So he lit a huge fire so that he was able to see what he was doing.
Gotcha. Well, and moving on, which I find interesting because Phillips believed that Kelly had been killed by a slash to the throat, and all the mutilations were performed afterwards. So we now know that all the victims up to this point did not have to, quote unquote, live through the mutilation. At least that's what we suspect. Okay. But what I find incredibly interesting is that he also states, and this is quote, in each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific or anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or a horse slaughterer or a person accustomed to cut up dead animals. So, again, the crime scene's available online if you really want to delve into it. And I kind of want to break away from the macabre and talk a little bit about, did you want to add anything to Mary Kelly?
No.
So kind of breaking away from the macabre, only because, one, I think we get a pretty fair depiction of the Canonical Five. And I think we understand basically what's happening at that point. So we had talked about, we're going to focus a little bit on the paranormal part of this. And this will do with the ghosts of the five Canonical Five. The five. Okay, so the ghost of Mary Ann Polly Nichols, who was the first victim. Basically, what people notice is that every so often on Durward Street, they see a hidden huddled figured woman laying down in the same area in which she was killed. And this is reported by quite a few people. So this is a very normal occurrence. So if you're in that area, from what I understand, this happens pretty regularly. So, and of all the places that all the murders happen, this happens to be an area that was, now granted, it's been renovated since then, but the street is pretty much the same. Nothing's really been altered. So it would make sense that this would happen regularly if you believe in that. And I think this is probably more what we would consider a residual haunting, because I don't think there's really any active part of it. But that is the ghost of Polly Ann Nichols. We'll move on to the ghost of Elizabeth Stride. So the ghost of Elizabeth Stride is an interesting one too. So, of course, that happened on the 30th of September, the night of the double murder, and the Ripper murdered 2 women. The first woman, of course, Elizabeth Stride, was not mutilated, as the murderer was probably disturbed, as we talked about, and is believed the reason why he did not mutilate her. But she did let out a scream, but nobody came to help her. And one of the paranormal things that they hear is a disembodied woman scream, and that can be heard on Burner Street. So that's probably a pretty unnerving thing to hear, just kind of out in the middle of nowhere. The ghost of Catherine Eddowes. This one's also kind of interesting because she was mutilated. And the area that this happened, which is Mitre Street, it's called Ripper Corner, which is just a terrible thing to say. And it's changed quite a bit. But apparently, if you dare to visit Mitre Square in the dark of September night, I'm quoting here, you might catch a glimpse of a spectral figure laying on that very spot that she was killed. And if you go there at night, the night of her death, you might see the corner where she died glow red, which that'd be pretty interesting. Okay, I buy the whole, you were murdered in this particular area, so you're going to have some connectivity to it, but I'm not sure I understand what the glowing red is. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, with all of them, the city of London, they know these stories very well. There's tours, all this stuff. Is it just people wanting to see stuff?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, and having said that, you're right, because they offer tours of this. So
yeah, you
can go right now to London, book a tour, and they take you to all these different sites. So yeah, you got to take that with a grain of salt.
Right. And
because they got to sell tickets.
Yeah. Well, and with each one of these, every single victim, every single one of them has a story where they're seen in the spot that they died. Right. We know, as watching, paranormal stuff and investigating it and talking about it, that you're not just going to be a ghost for every single thing, every murder that's happened.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, were they all traumatic? Absolutely. But the probability of all 5 of them appearing where they died is very, very low. I could see 1 or 2.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe. But I think it's more of a, I want to see this.
Right.
You know what I mean?
So they fabricate it, you think?
And all that stuff.
Well,
as
it's
far
definitely
as
the most unsolved murder that they've had. So.
Right. It's a big thing that people go to do.
Sure.
And, when you do these ghost tours, because we've been on several, they like to tell you everything that people tell them. And you can tell which ones are probably like, eh. Yeah. Or ones that they fabricate just to try to make the tour interesting. and what is actually probably reality.
I've always found that the ones that are more grandiose are the ones that I typically go, yeah.
Yeah.
But the ghost of Mary Jane Kelly, apparently during the months following her murder, her ghost could be seen entering Miller's Court. And the strange aspect to her murder is that several witnesses claim to have seen and spoken to Mary Kelly on the morning of November 9th, when the fact that she may have already been murdered.
See, that one I find more.
Yeah.
Because, and look what happened to her compared to the others. I mean, the rest of them were, torn apart, but she was really, and he took his time with her and he slashed her throat, whereas the others, he kind of just choked him to death. Yeah. Which I'm not saying one's worse than the other.
No, I mean, it's all awful, yeah.
But you know what I mean? He was probably a lot more violent with her than he was the others because he knew he was in an enclosed space where he could get away with it.
He had all the time in the world.
Yeah. He went as fast as he could out on the street because he had to, time was of the essence then. Yeah,
and that's sort of where that kind of ends because Mary Jane Kelly was the crescendo. That was his, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but that was his masterpiece. I mean, that sounds terrible, but that was like the thing everything had been building up to. Mm-hmm. He had been rushed through some. He had his first couple killings. And then listen, these are not the only victims that people are trying to put on Jack the Ripper. I think there's up to like 11. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of that is true because it just doesn't match up with some of this. And it looks like everything just kind of built up to the Mary Jane Kelly killing.
True, but I also, with serial killers, they don't stop.
Right.
They stop if they get caught and go to prison, or they die, or they just move and they go somewhere else and start it all over again. Yep. But they don't just stop. And that's what I find weird because they don't ever hit their masterpiece usually.
Right.
They even, serial killers that have been interviewed, they have the urge. They say they try to fight it and they can fight it for months, years, but then it comes back and they have to do it again. Like they have to do it.
True. So we don't even know if that were the last ones.
We don't. I mean, that's just in sequence to each other.
Yeah.
That's the last one.
It's time we focus a little bit on who some of the suspects are. They spent so much time trying to figure out who Jack the Ripper was that there's no way we could focus on that.
Right. And he had to be somebody that blended in because he had to be able on those streets where there's no alleyways to escape. He had to be able to get out of there and not cause any suspicion. He probably walked by a ton of those cops.
Yeah.
And because if he's dressed like everybody else, like a gentleman, and he's not, running around with blood all over him.
There is one that, to me, really just sort of stands out. It's the one that just recently was one that was revealed to me. So, a little truth in advertising. We do some research prior to this. I'm the one that did the research for this one, so it's probably not as good as it's the one Nicole usually does the research for. There's a Smithsonian channel documentary about this, and they do a very good job of explaining the suspect in which we're about to reveal. But do you remember the very, very, very first victim? She was on a road that...
It's a street.
Yeah, it's a street.
Just imagine a row of houses on both sides. There's no way to get on the other side unless you go through the front door and then through a back door. I mean, you have to go down the whole street to get to the other side.
That's what I was trying to get to. Anyway, it is probably the most important murder. They're all important. They're all awful. They are part of the Jack the Ripper lore. This one is the one that gets overlooked. And sadly, I think this is the one where we find the actual killer.
Yeah.
We had mentioned that the very first person to show up at the site where Marianne Nichols was, this Cross guy, right? That's where things get a little interesting. So Charles Cross, he was there first before, was it Richard Paul. Mm-hmm. He was the first one to arrive. Nobody knows exactly what time he arrived. He says he got there at 3:40. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows that for sure. His job would get him from because he gave his address. And interestingly enough, he gave his name as Charles Cross at the Inquisition.
Yes.
Right? But that's not his name. It turns out his name is Charles Allen Lechmere. He gave a false name, which is at an Inquisition. And at that time, that's not something that you did. You know, it's very important.
Or at any time.
Right, at any time. But especially back then, they were always worried, and you always wanted to give accurate information because they would find out. So he says his name is Charles Allen Cross, but his real name is Charles Allen Lechmere. And from his apartment where he lived, he would walk to his job all the way on the other end in Whitechapel. And guess what he did for a living? He was a carter, like we said, and he delivered things at night. What he delivered was meat. So this man worked for a meat company. And it wasn't like he was, delivering a couple slices of veal to the local person. No, this man was delivering large amounts of beef. And would be seen. This guy shows up, and he says he gets there at 3:40. And it would have taken him roughly about 7 minutes to get from his door to where the body lay. Right?
Yeah.
However, there was somebody else who left at the same time, and that was this Richard Paul. And he lived basically in the same area. They would have left at exactly the same time because this man was running late and he was watching his clock. So he was trying to make
what the time was.
Yeah, he knew exactly what time it was. So here's this guy taking off down the road. It would have only taken roughly 7 minutes to get from door to murder scene. Apparently, this man would have had a lot more time with that body than
what he said.
He would have had almost 10 minutes, right? What's important about that is neither gentleman said that they saw each other as they were walking to the murder site. If they left at the same time and got there roughly at the same time, they would have seen each other.
Yeah.
That's not what they report. Here we've got Lechmere standing at this body, and you've got Paul coming up, roughly behind him. And obviously, we already stated there's one way, or there's two ways in and out. You're going to see that person walking.
Well,
right?
He could have heard him, is what they were saying, because of the type of shoes that they wore were loud, smacking. So he would have had time to do things,
right,
and hide himself. He basically said that he didn't see him till he got right up on the body, like he came out of the shadows.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part because he would have seen him.
Yeah.
So we've got anywhere from about 5 minutes, 6 minutes of time there. What they do a really good job in this show is they have a forensic scientist breaking it down. The type of wounds that were given to Marianne Nichols, as extensive as they were, could have been done in roughly 2 minutes. And that still gives a whole lot of time.
Yeah.
The argument is Lechmere could have gotten there earlier, done his thing.
Choked her out.
Still had plenty of time to, unfortunately take her life by cutting her throat, doing the multiple stabbings, place the body. And while he's doing this, he knows that other guy's coming. He can see him. So he's trying to hurry up. He's getting it set up. He still knows that the body is laying down. Her blouse is still up, but it's just one of those things where he's kind of trying to hurry and put her down. So this guy, Paul, comes up and he looks and he goes, "Oh, crap, what's going on?" So when he gets there, he checks Marianne, and he says that he could sense a small breath. I don't think that's accurate.
No, but he couldn't tell anything else because didn't they say that he'd pulled the shirt down over the abdomen? Because didn't he stab her in the abdomen?
Yes,
but he pulled the shirt down over it.
Pulled the shirt down, right.
And he didn't see any blood, so he assumed, I guess there's a lot of passed out drunk people.
Right.
Or someone asleep in that area. That's what he assumed because he didn't see any pooling of blood. There were no marks on her. The guy didn't have any blood on him. And what they explained is that, she was already dead and he cut. The blood pressure is not there to make the blood spurt. So it would have just kind of leaked out.
Right. And what's more important about that is it is so fresh that it hadn't started pulling yet.
Right. So he came upon him within the first 2 minutes probably.
Yeah. I mean, maybe there was faint breath, but by the time, who knows?
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about that is we had mentioned at the very beginning of the show that they don't decide, they leave together. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that is we now have potentially the killer with another witness leaving the scene. Now, I had mentioned there were cops all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. It is much easier to see two men walking out of that street to report this than one person.
Right.
They can corroborate somewhat the story. Mm-hmm. So we now have potentially Jack the Ripper leaving with this Paul guy, and they come across another constable, and they say, "Hey, constable, there is a person, either passed out or drunk or whatever, but she's in need of medical attention." Right. Mm-hmm. And in a very astute way, we'll just say the Jack the Ripper. We shouldn't say that, but Lechmere pulls the constable aside. There's already a cop there, which that is incredibly important, because had he not had said that, number one, that constable would have raised the alarm. Mm-hmm. But he figured, well, there's already somebody there, so I don't have to do that. So that's number one.
Right.
Number two, if there was no constable there, he would have sure as heck taken those two back to the body, because he wouldn't know at that time if potentially one of them was the murderer.
Right.
So, and they were very astute back then. They were smart cops. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying the ones today aren't, but I'm just saying they didn't have the technology that we have now
Just because it was the 1800s doesn't mean that they didn't know what they were doing.
Exactly. They had to be on point because they didn't have some of the stuff that we enjoy today. So that doesn't happen. And that's really important because there's so much time in between that. And, of course, Lechmere and Paul, they leave. Now, this constable goes there and finds out that, in fact, there was a cop there. And that is just sheer chance. Mm-hmm. Because this other constable happened to be on his beat and discovers the body. Now, when he gets there, now the body's changed. Mm-hmm. There is
blood pooling underneath the neck.
Mm-hmm. And they had decided to pull her, Paul and Lechmere had decided to pull her skirt all the way down. So now we've got blood pooling. We've got an obvious murder scene. It's not anymore where Paul thinks it's somebody drunk off their butt and needs some medical attention.
Right.
Now, if that wasn't the only thing, because it's not, that's a lot to go on, right? But what's more important is if you were to, and again, they do this really well in that show, and I urge you guys to watch it, but they do a really good graph of showing how his path to get to work, even an alternate path, both paths to get to his work, they absolutely hit every single murder with the exception of one.
Yeah.
So what is also interesting about that is the timing of the murders. So he would have left his house super early, 3:30, I think is what they said, roughly 3:30 a.m. Anyway, real early in the morning. He would basically hit every single murder site, not just the path, but at the time of their killings. Mm-hmm. So let's say...
Well, he would at least have been working.
Right, he'd have been working, but more importantly, as he was walking, he would have legitimately hit every single murder in path, canonically. I got to throw that in there because I like that word. He would have hit every one of them, and he would have been on scene every single time these murders happened. And I love what the guy says, either this guy was the murderer, he was the most unlucky man in London at that time.
Right.
So what's interesting is it puts them pretty much every single one of them. And this all can be corroborated because they know where he lived. Mm-hmm. They know what time he had to be to work. And they knew his paths. Now, the only one that does not make sense, that's a little out of it, can also be explained. You see, Lechmere worked Monday through Friday. I think Sunday as well. His only day off was Saturday. When was Elizabeth Stride's murder? And the other one, the two, was on a Saturday. Mm-hmm. So I know that's kind of an out there scenario, but picture this. His mom and one of his daughters lived around the corner of where Elizabeth Stride was murdered on his day off.
Convenient.
Very convenient. And then, of course, all the rest of them were on his route. So, look, is it the smoking gun? No. Are we ever going to know for sure? No. Because unfortunately, whatever little evidence we have, I mean, we're never going to find out. And all the great evidence, unfortunately, was destroyed in the Blitz. Thanks, Nazis. So, we're never going to know for sure. But this particular person has so much going for him in the sense that he was at each location. But more important than that, he worked for a meat company. Mm-hmm. He had access to probably the most sharpest instruments out there.
Right.
I mean, and it would not be uncommon for him to be seen wearing bloody clothing.
That's what they said. It was very common.
It's very common. Now, it doesn't necessarily make a big deal for the first four, because there wasn't a ton of blood. But it makes a hell of a lot of difference for Mary Ann Kelly. Mm-hmm. Because there is no way that a transfer of blood did not happen between that victim and that killer.
Oh, no way.
So if he walks out of there of Miller Square and he's got blood on him, it's not that big of a deal there.
Could have just worn his work clothes.
Right. He just worn his work clothes. Got to work, went into the facility.
The stable.
And cleaned himself up. Got rid of the evidence because...
They said they had washing things in there or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had washing stations.
They would clean up. Mm-hmm.
You betcha. Clean right up. And nobody would have batted an eye because blood would have been normal.
It was convenient.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, we're never going to know for sure.
No, but what was interesting on the documentary, the reason he gave the name Cross was because they went back through old historical records, and they would always do the census of who lived in the home. He had a stepdad for a time by the last name of Cross.
Right.
So he used that with the police.
Yep.
So he kept his first and his middle name. He just changed the last name.
That's something.
And then they couldn't match that to the address. But he was known as that for a short time period when he was a kid.
He sure was.
But that wasn't his actual name. And they tracked him, and it's interesting, and we'll put this on the Facebook if we can find a copy of the picture. But in, what was it? They said 1912.
1912 or
They
something.
think he became fairly wealthy. He had a family and had, 12 kids or something like that.
Those amount of kids.
They've got a picture of him.
Yeah. So we may have
a picture of Jack the Ripper.
Jack the Ripper.
Mm-hmm. But what made him stop? That's still my curiosity of why he stopped.
I don't know. Maybe he fell into fortune. I mean, we know that he started making money.
What's that have to do with an urge like that, though?
Who knows? I don't know. But we'd love to know your opinion, guys. I mean, if you have thoughts, Facebook, you can reach us there. You can reach us at our website. But we'd love to hear what you guys think. And, of course, you can reach us at gxparanormal.com. That's our website. And our Facebook is called?
Generation X Paranormal Podcast.
Yeah. That's a joke, guys, because I messed that up a couple of episodes ago. So, anyway, we'll see you then. We're also on YouTube, and we'll catch you guys later.